Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have accurately preserved memories of coastal flooding events from over 7,000 years ago. No books, no writing, just voices passed down for roughly 300 generations. Think about that for a second. Try remembering what your grandparents told you about your own family, word for word, and most of us can't get that right after 2 generations. So how does a story survive 300 of them? For 95% of human history, writing didn't exist. The earliest writing systems only show up around 5,000 years ago. Everything before that, every law, every warning, every piece of history, every technique for finding water in a drought, all of it lived in one place only: someone's head. And when that person died, if they hadn't told someone else, it was gone forever. So the real question isn't why ancient humans told stories. It's how they made sure those stories didn't die with them. And the answer is one of the most underrated inventions in human history. Not a tool you can hold, a technology built entirely out of sound. Let's start with the Aboriginal songlines, because they're the single best evidence we have that oral memory can be staggeringly precise. Songlines are pathways across the Australian landscape, encoded into songs, stories, and ceremony that describe the route, the landmarks, the water sources, and the dangers of a journey that can stretch for hundreds of miles. In 2015, geographer Patrick Nunn and linguist Nicholas Reed published research showing that Aboriginal oral traditions from multiple coastal regions consistently describe specific islands as being connected to the mainland. Places that have been underwater since the end of the last ice age, roughly 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. These weren't vague legends about a flood. They named actual locations. They described actual geography that existed before the sea rose. That means these stories were transmitted accurately across roughly 300 generations without a single written word. Nunn and Reed didn't think this was possible at first, either. The assumption in linguistics for a long time was that oral traditions degrade fast, that details blur and vanish within a few generations, like a game of telephone played across centuries. But the evidence didn't support that. Something was keeping these stories intact. So what was the mechanism? Here's where it gets interesting. In 2015, science writer Lynn Kelly published a book called The Memory Code, and her argument was simple but radical. Oral cultures didn't just tell stories. They engineered them to be unforgettable. And the engineering had almost nothing to do with the content and everything to do with the structure. Rhythm was the first tool. Rhythm makes information sticky. You already know this. You can probably still sing the alphabet song, but you couldn't recite the alphabet in a flat monotone with the same ease. Ancient oral traditions used meter, the same way epic poetry does, to lock information into a predictable beat that the brain holds onto almost automatically. Repetition was the second tool. Not lazy repetition, structural repetition. Formulaic phrases repeated at key moments, so the speaker always had a fixed anchor point to return to if their memory started to slip. And rhyme, alliteration, and parallel sentence structures did the same job, giving the brain patterns instead of raw, disconnected facts. Then there's the technique that might be the most impressive of all, the memory palace, also called the method of loci. This is a technique where you mentally attach pieces of information to specific physical locations along a path you already know intimately. Ancient Greek and Roman orators used it to memorize entire speeches, but Lynn Kelly's research suggests indigenous cultures across Australia, North America, and the Pacific were doing something remarkably similar, tens of thousands of years earlier. A songline isn't just a story. It's a memory palace stretched across an actual landscape. Every hill, every waterhole, every rock formation becomes a mental hook holding a specific piece of information in place. Walk the landscape, and you walk the story. Forget your place in the song, and you can literally look around you to find it again. The land itself became the filing system. Now let's go to ancient Greece, because this is where the science of oral memory got studied in real time. In the 1930s, a scholar named Milman Parry became obsessed with a strange problem. Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are enormous. Together, they run over 25,000 lines. And for centuries, scholars assumed a single genius must have composed and memorized them word for word. But Parry noticed something odd in the text. Certain phrases repeated constantly. Rosy-fingered dawn, wine-dark sea, swift-footed Achilles. These weren't just poetic flourishes. They were exactly the length needed to fill specific gaps in the poem's rhythmic meter. So Parry and his student Albert Lord traveled to Yugoslavia in the 1930s to study living oral poets, Singers who had never learned to read, who could perform epic poems lasting hours entirely from memory. And what they discovered changed how we understand oral tradition forever. These singers weren't memorizing the poems word for word at all. They were using a giant toolkit of pre-built phrases, formulas that fit the meter, and reassembling the story fresh every single time they performed it. The story stayed the same. The exact words never did. This is called oral formulaic composition, and it means Homer, if there even was a single Homer, wasn't a genius who memorized 25,000 lines. He was a master of an ancient system, a system built by countless generations of poets before him, refining a toolkit designed specifically to survive without paper. Here's a version of this that's even more extreme. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in the world, was composed in India roughly 3,500 years ago. It contains over 10,000 verses, and for well over 2,000 years, it wasn't written down at all. It was transmitted purely orally, generation after generation, by Vedic priests. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you. When scholars eventually compared oral recitations from priests living thousands of miles apart, separated by centuries, the versions matched almost exactly, down to individual syllables and tonal accents. To achieve that level of precision, Vedic tradition developed something extraordinary, methods of reciting the same verse forwards, backwards, and in scrambled word patterns, specifically so that any single error would be immediately obvious to both the speaker and the listener. This wasn't casual storytelling. This was a verification system built directly into the act of memorization, a built-in spell check running on nothing but trained human memory. Now let's talk about West Africa, because there's a role here that doesn't get nearly enough attention: the griot. In many West African societies, particularly across Mali, Senegal, and Guinea, griots were professional oral historians. Their entire life's work was memorizing the genealogies, histories, and legal precedents of entire kingdoms. Some griot lineages claim to preserve oral histories stretching back over 700 years, covering the rise and fall of empires like Mali under Sundiata Keita in the 13th century. A griot wasn't just a storyteller. A griot was a walking archive, a living legal record, and in many cases, a political advisor, all rolled into one profession that took years of apprenticeship to master. So here's what all of these traditions actually have in common. It wasn't talent. It wasn't luck. It was infrastructure, mental infrastructure, built out of rhythm, repetition, landscape, formula, and verification, engineered over thousands of years to keep information alive without a single written page. Your ancestors weren't just talking around a fire for entertainment. They were running the only information storage system that existed. And it worked. It worked for 95% of human history. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you a little. That system didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because we stopped needing it. The moment writing became widespread, the pressure to train memory this intensely evaporated within a few generations. You still have the same brain your ancestors had, wired for rhythm, for pattern, for narrative structure. You just never had to build the muscle because you've always had a notebook to catch you. So the next time you forget a phone number you just heard 10 seconds ago, remember this. Somewhere in the deep architecture of your mind is a system built to hold entire histories, entire legal codes, entire maps of the physical world without writing a single word down. It's not that your brain got worse. It's that for the first time in 300,000 years, it finally got to rest.